Mhm. All right. Hello, everybody out there in internet land. It's odd chairing one of these kinds of things because you can't see the faces of the audience, but I can see several of you are introducing yourselves in the chat box on the right-hand side, and I just want to welcome everybody to this, the seventh in a series of public events that we've been organizing for the UK Department for International Development. My name is Brian Lucas. I manage the Governance and Social Development Resource Center, the GSDRC, and we have been producing for DFID a series of professional development products for its staff, including a series of reading packs, e-learning courses, and other publications. And this event and these other presentations are being recorded largely so that DFID staff can refer to them after the event. The recording will be available on our website. The world's population has doubled in my lifetime, I recently calculated. And that's probably not going to happen again. Population isn't going likely to double again, but we are witnessing another kind of very profound demographic shift. Historically, the world has always had more young people than elderly people, leading to the classic triangle shape of diagrams showing the age structure of population. But better health and declining fertility mean that the proportions of the population in each age bracket are starting to equalize. So in the past few years, people have been talking about the end of the classic population pyramid shape. And this is likely to lead to major changes in how we approach development, both for young people and older people. In many low-income countries, there is still a very large population, proportion of the population that is very young and disproportionately affected by poverty. But at the same time, the world's population is aging dramatically. In a generation or two, there will be more people over age 60 than under age 15. So what does this mean for intergenerational relations? What are the social and economic implications for development? Our two presenters today will help us explore some of the challenges that are likely to arise over the next generation or two and how we might consider trying to adapt to deal with them. Our first presenter is Laura Camfield, Senior Lecturer at the University of East Anglia. And she does research on children and young people, well-being and evaluation, using various qualitative and mixed methods approaches. She works most frequently in sub-Saharan Africa and is currently working on a longitudinal qualitative study of youth entrepreneurs in Uganda and a mixed methods evaluation of a DFID-funded girls' schooling intervention in Mozambique. Asghar Zaidi is a professor in international social policy at the University of Southampton. He leads on research for the Active Aging Index, a project looking at how older people participate in employment, in social and cultural life, and independent living. And he developed the methodology for the Global Age Watch Index, the first global index to measure the well-being of older people. So Laura and Asghar will each give a short opening presentation, drawing on the reading packs that they have prepared for DFID's professional development program. And then we'll invite questions from the audience. You can type your questions in the chat box that you can see on the side of your screen. And we'll wrap up in just about an hour and a half from now by 2 o'clock p.m. UK time. So I'd like to first then give the floor to our first presenter Laura Camfield.
Right, we'll see if I've learned how to share my screen properly. So I'm very excited to be talking to you today, simply because it's an opportunity for me to speak to the people who are reading the pack and hear your questions. Developing it is obviously quite a solitary activity, so I'll be quite interested to hear your feedback and to hear the kinds of things that it brought to mind for you. In setting up the webinar, the organiser gave us some overarching questions that we should address to, in a sense, bring together our presentations. I mean, Asghar and I are obviously arguing from, or conversing from different ends of the age spectrum. One of the points that I would make in the presentation is the importance of these intergenerational relationships in children and young people's lives, and also the importance of social protection, which I know is a theme that Asghar will elaborate on as well. And just returning to what we covered in the reading packs, obviously I was emphasising that a very large proportion currently of the population are under 15, and this is particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa. They're very active agents. I think anyone working in development would have seen this long before sort of new childhood studies told us that this was the case, although that's also been an important influence. And in a sense, we've left them with quite a lot of problems in relation to environmental change and unplanned urbanisation, which the work particularly of Kate Goff, who was going to be speaking in the webinar, has illustrated very well. So as young people age, they face further problems in securing employment, education and training. They might be 4 times less likely to find a job than adults, and actually their lack of material security hinders their becoming adults, making that important life transition. So I think these facts illustrate the importance of taking what's now called a relational approach, which looks at support and obligation within and between generations. So not just looking at the way that young people support each other, and there are plenty of examples of siblings supporting younger children, for example, but also looking at how these relationships of support and obligation cross different generations. So how grandparents might use their social pensions to support grandchildren, or how children might feel less able to concentrate on their studies because they feel a need to work and be part of the contributing to the household unit. So what I'll argue in this brief introduction is to look at this concept of generationing development, which I discussed in the reading pack, and try and make it a little bit more concrete. So by generationing development, I mean looking at relational understandings of poverty, which have become, I think, more popular, and the way that people progress through the life course, but also acknowledging the centrality of children and young people in processes of social reproduction, working, caring. It would be quite a limited view of children and young people's lives to see it as in any way centred around education. So this additional perspective enables us to think about how programmes affect children's social well-being and how important it is for children to be able to fulfil the roles that they value. And this can be quite an important insight in terms of looking at children's schooling attendance and whether in fact it's better to have sort of full-day schooling or shift schooling, which can perhaps be a little bit more flexible around their other responsibilities. So as Brian was saying, my interest at the moment is very much within evaluation and how you capture intended and unintended social impacts of programmes. And I take the example of social protection and draw on my own work and others to sort of elaborate this idea. It's obviously not a new one, but I think it's one that's been given quite a lot of systematic attention at the moment with the growth of new evaluation methods. So to draw on Stephen Devereux and Katie Rowland's work, they map a typology of different social relationships that essentially you need to be looking at to understand how programmes are working or not working. And this obviously applies to all programmes, not just sort of child-focused ones, but it is, I think, particularly important in, say, forms of child-sensitive social protection. So looking at aspects of gender, of generation, of the position of particular children within the household related to how they're related to the household head. And then, of course, the broader landscape of relationships that affect how the programme is administered. And this can give rise then to intended and very positive social impacts, but also unintended and negative ones. So they map 9 different categories, moving from a sort of double success where the intervention not only does what it's supposed to do and achieves concrete material benefits, but also it has no unplanned social consequences that are actually quite negative. It's probably fairly rare for interventions to achieve this, but obviously what we most want to avoid is a situation where an intervention both fails materially and actually leaves people worse off, and that can sometimes be the case, as you know, around various forms of credit intervention. So quite a lot of work has been done, particularly in Latin America, around these sorts of social impacts connected to social protection programmes. And Michelle Adato, but also Natalia Stroili from Young Lives, Maxine Molinier, have looked at the effects of programmes such as Progressa in Mexico and RDP in Nicaragua. So here we're seeing, certainly from the quantitative evidence, quite concrete material benefits, but also quite negative effect on community social relationships. And this can be quite problematic in terms of participants in the programme building fairly specific forms of social capital with other programme participants, but then perhaps less able to share in communal activities. And people who might have participated fairly happily in work groups alongside programme recipients now resent the fact that, as they see it, the recipients are receiving something for the communal work that they're doing and they're not. And then, of course, there are also resentment, envy, gossip, and sometimes occasionally confrontation. And this, of course, isn't just confined to adults. Adato's work in Nicaragua suggests it has quite a concrete effect on children's relationships. And this was also what Natalia Stroili found in Peru, where children are very aware of the children who are receiving benefits are very aware of the differences between them and other children. And this can become a source of anxiety in the schoolroom, for example. In fact, in relation to the quote below, there's a sort of happy ending in that the particular community where this interview took place later took an initiative to club together to ensure that every child who attended the school had the same amount of schooling materials, whether they were participants in the programme or not. So what I'm also interested in are the social impacts at the individual level, and I should perhaps have said that this is I'm presenting data from a paper published in 2015, which combined a quite comprehensive literature review with some empirical data from Young Lives. So there are clear impacts at the individual level, and looking particularly at girls' lives, we see very strong effects on their work. In some countries, yes, we see a reduction, but often we don't see a reduction to the same extent as the increase in enrolment in schooling, which suggests that a number of children are under quite a lot of pressure in combining work and schooling. But sometimes you see an increase. In Ethiopia, there have been quite pronounced substitution effects, and again, this evidence, much of it comes from Young Lives work, where there are both direct effects when young girls are participating in the programme, and substitution effects where, in order to meet the work quota, other adults within the household are doing that, and then the girls are sort of picking up their household chores and other responsibilities. What's perhaps a little bit more puzzling is the many cases where the evidence is completely conflicting. In Brazil, 3 studies showed increases in work, decreases in work, and absolutely no effect. And we can start to think through some of the reasons why that might be. So increased female employment, and then there's quite a lot of qualitative evidence of increased work for girls, particularly where no childcare alternatives exist. So if we then look at how these effects might be differentiated, I mean, we see, for example, in Nicaragua, participation in social protection programs reduces the work of boys, but it doesn't reduce the work of older girls. And the particular vulnerability of older girls is, in fact, a theme that threads through the review. We see differences according to location, but we also see quite specific differences within the household. So the treated children, the children who receive the benefit and whose attendance at school is monitored, do attend regularly, but we also see that other children in the household don't, as they're the ones sort of picking up the work to allow the treated child to attend and fulfill the conditionalities. We also see that where programmes bring changes in household assets, this often has quite a pronounced effect. So participants in PSNP in Ethiopia are expected to enrol in what's called the Other Food Support Programme. It now has a slightly different name, which loans money for cattle to support graduation after 5 years. So within social protection programmes, there's obviously a great debate around it's not intended to be a permanent benefit. It's intended to help people reach a point where they can manage on their own. And so other initiatives such as loaning money for cattle can be part of that. But many authors such as Lula Pankhurst have shown that these are actually quite risky enterprises to engage in. And many people find themselves, the cow dies, they expend money on veterinary fees that they never get back, and then they're left with a very large loan to pay off, which arguably puts them in an even worse position than they were when they first started receiving PSNP. An added factor is that cattle bring their own workload with them, and this tends to have a particular impact on young children, causing late enrolment in school, and also on girls. I've already mentioned the problem with the absence of childcare, and we see that in the cases of the two programmes in Ethiopia and India, both of which are essentially food for work programmes, PSNP doesn't provide any childcare, and NREGA in India only provides it in less than 10% of work sites. So when we see very high female participation figures in NREGs, the question that many authors have thrown up is, where are their children? So many of you, I'm sure, work in the field of evaluation, and these are probably the kinds of unintended consequences that kind of keep you up late at night. But how do you capture these within an evaluation? A great deal of thinking is obviously going on around this. So there are the sort of two countervailing tendencies. There's maybe a greater emphasis on experimental and quasi-experimental methods, but alongside that, well, how do we actually get under the mechanisms and see what's really happening? And that might be through using mixed methods or theory-based evaluations or different forms of evaluation such as realist evaluation. Another one that's being put forward is the idea of a wellbeing focused evaluation, and this arises very much from work of Alistair McGregor and colleagues at IDS, and that tries to capture the effects of programmes at three different levels: the material effects on relationships and social cohesion within the community, but also on people's subjective experiences or quality of life. So here in the example of a social protection programme, we can see the different levels at which these effects occur, but we can also see the very concrete effects that the programme has on people's relationship with the market, with the state, with the community, and particularly within their households. So a comprehensive evaluation, Alistair McGregor might argue, would try to capture all of these different effects, whether they were specified in the programme theory or not. But the example that he gives is the Zambian child grant evaluation, and I think this really shows the value of these sorts of methods for looking particularly at social protection programmes and programmes involving children. They were evaluating two different types of programmes alongside an RCT component, and their particular focus was what are the subjective and relational effects of cash transfers on recipients and non-recipients. And this is building on other literature, for example from Malawi, which suggested that the very fact that a cash transfer was being given rather than a transfer in kind had quite a concrete effect on relationships within communities. So they started with participatory methods and focus group discussions, focusing particularly on gender differences and differences between recipients and non-recipients, with the aim of building rapport as part of a sort of fairly lengthy research process, but also getting a strong sense of what people actually value within particular communities, what a person must have, be able to do or be in a particular community in order to live well. This then led, through a sort of sequenced mixed methods approach, to the application of a draft survey instrument and further interviews and focus groups to look particularly at how people graduate or move out of poverty, or in fact whether those processes are taking place. So they found that both schemes have positive impacts on people's well-being, and also a very nice spillover effect on the well-being of others, and this was particularly true in the case of the 10% scheme. Just focusing on relational well-being, they found that recipients were sharing the grant, they were experiencing less dependency, and as a result they were experiencing higher psychological well-being because they regarded themselves to be less of a burden on others and more able to contribute. But they did find perhaps something that needs to be looked at in the future, were that some aspects of support systems were becoming monetized, which could potentially be quite exclusive. So thinking about new ways of doing evaluation and some of the perennial problems around evaluating child and youth focused programs, I'm now involved in the Global Girls Research Initiative, which is led out of, it's funded by DFID, it's coordinated by ODI, but brings in a great deal of expertise across the world. And its aim is, much as Young Lives did, to run a longitudinal study, but not an observational study, but a study focused around particular interventions. So how is 12 Plus performing in Rwanda? How is the work that BRAC is doing around microcredit and economic empowerment really improving young girls and young women's lives? And what in a sense can we learn from this about what actually works for young women and girls? It's an 8-year study initially with the possibility of a 5-year extension, and it's very much focused around doing quite a serious mixed methods design, which starts with the qualitative, then moves to quantitative, then goes back to qualitative for in-depth interviews, going back on a very regular basis, working with 2 cohorts of children, initially ones aged 10 to 12 and 14 to 15. Another aspect that it's bringing in the countries that it's not working in is participatory research on the legacy effects of different programs. So how can you involve slightly older girls in evaluating programs and coming to conclusions about how effective they were or otherwise, and ways in which they could have been improved? So in the presentation, which is possibly a little fast, I've tried to touch on 2 of the overarching questions around the practical implications of generation development. How do we actually do this? What does it mean? But also thinking about the role of social protection in addressing the sorts of issues that Asghar will now go on to raise. My personal feeling is that social protection plus basic services offers great potential for creating a strong generation of children and young people who can better support an ageing population. But I'm also very aware that it needs to be designed, managed, and particularly evaluated in a way that's sensitive to children's existing commitments and their relationships of support and obligation.
Thanks, Laura. Asghar, should we turn over to you for your
Yes,
presentation, and then
uh,
we'll take questions from the audience.
absolutely. Good afternoon. Let me start by sharing my slides. Okay, and okay. Well, I'm very happy, and Laura has set the floor quite well for me to start presenting what are the challenges that we face on the other end of the age spectrum when we start talking about older people. There is no specific definition of what older people, how should we go about defining older people. Very often we use the age cutoff of 60 plus to be referred to as older people. And very often it's not just the situation they face during old age that affects their well-being. It is, as Laura implied from her work, that it is some of the early life experiences that affects how capable older people are in later life. And then comes the broader question that since we are all societies are fast aging, we have a rising share of older people in our societies, what implications that demographic change has on economic development, economic and social development. So I will not, in the next 10-15 minutes, will be able to do justice to this topic, but I will go very quickly, pick up some aspects from the reading pack that we have produced for DFID with the help of GSDRC. But then I will point to some of the work that I'm doing with HelpAge International, in which we are providing quantitative evidence on well-being of older people across the world. We have in it 94 countries covered in that work, and we developed an index called Global Age Watch Index. So I thought, in addition to what you have already seen in the reading pack, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have on that. I point to some of this work that we are doing at HelpAge International and see what implications, what insights it provides us in terms of aging and development. So hold on to your seats now. This is the overview. I will provide you very quick facts and figures on population aging. Most of that you would already know. Some of it has been referred to in the reading pack. Then I will move on to this other piece of work that that I'm doing with HelpAge International called Global Age Watch Index. And followed by, having introduced the index, I will provide you some insights from its latest report so that we could see how exercises of this sort give us additional information about well-being of older people, about the policies that affects their well-being, and what policies and programs can be brought about in the future. So facts and figures on population aging, and referring to population economic development as well. It's no hidden fact that all societies are aging. In the latest year, for which we have data available, 12.3% of the population is over the age of 60. That corresponds to 900 million people. But by 2050, we will have 21.5% of the population belonging to that age group, 60 plus, and amounting to close to 2 billion people of that age group. This is not scaremongering. This is more of realizing that this number of older people would be living, almost 1 out of every 5 persons would be age 60 plus. And if societies do not learn to bring about policies that would make best use of the potential of older people, then this will become a serious challenge for many societies. Another fact you could look at is that, which is quite alarming in the sense that today we only have one society, one country, Japan, in which we have more than 30% of the population age 60 and more. And by 2050, we will have in excess of 60 countries belonging to that category of hyper-aging societies. So again, this is a challenge that many societies will be facing, and we need to find out what are the good practices to address the challenges, what are the good practices, policies and practices to reap the full potential of older people in our societies. There are serious variations across continents. For instance, Europe is the oldest of all continents. Even today, we have 1 out of 4 people age 60 plus, and by 2050, almost on average, many of the countries would be the what we call hyper-aging societies, because they will have 1/3 or more people belonging to 60 plus age category. But let's look at Africa, for instance, which is the youngest continent in the world, and now only 5.4% of the population is age 60 plus. But by 2050, there will be as many as 9% of the population. Fraction sometimes, proportion sometimes hide away very important information. For instance, the number of older people in African region would rise from close to 60 million to almost 200 million. So some would go about saying that such speed of population aging in poorer countries is the real challenge. In other contexts like Europe, which are more resource rich, the challenge is not that stark. I will be using the example of Portugal as one of the southern European countries to highlight some of the results. And in Portugal, already there's a high proportion of people living above, there's a high proportion of people of age 60 plus, and by 2050, almost 40% of the population will belong to that category. So what are the challenges? Aging and its link to development. The first thing is that all development strategies must empower older people by improving their well-being and quality of life. So right at the heart of any development strategy should be that it should empower, it should take care of the vulnerable, often vulnerable older people. Even if they are not vulnerable, then development strategies should continue to provide them opportunities so that they could continue to contribute to their own well-being as well as to the well-being of the society in which they are living. And in this respect, 2 bold pledges were made in the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals that came about in September last year. And one of those pledges which you will often hear, no one will be left behind. And that is often used, that people of all ages should be part of a development strategy. But also another goal has been that we endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. And that's basically implying that those who are worse off will have to be given greater focus in the development strategies that are sustainable. So this is about development strategies putting a focus on older people, but at the same time, the older people who are more empowered will in turn contribute to their own well-being, not just to their own well-being, but also to the overall development of the society. So it's a cycle that countries will have to get into, that if they start putting more focus on empowering a rising fraction of their population, which is referred to as older people, uh, then the same population in turn will contribute towards the development of the country. So it's not that the demographic shifts become a destiny to many countries. In fact, older people could be used as a resource to the society, but we need proper, appropriate policies to invest in older people and make the best use of the potential that they have. Some of the points that I'm drawing, and I've already referred to them in my talk, is about linking aging and development that are mentioned in the reading pack that you may have seen. And already I mentioned that the speed of aging is particularly fast in the developing world. So this is a more serious problem than the problem that we observe in many of the advanced countries, because countries are becoming older without even before they become rich. Youth bulge of today will be the elderly bulge of tomorrow. So that's another reference I made in the reading pack, that some of those societies that have a high proportion of younger people, the investment towards them and their health and financial position in later life will have to start early. That the same youth should have access to health care as well as opportunities to employment and saving, so that the bulge of the higher fraction of people we will have in the future of older people will not be struggling with those issues. There are also one other trend that is fast happening across the world, which is the urbanization trend. And many of the older people are living in urban settings. So this is another aspect that require careful attention from policymakers, that what policies towards healthcare provision, social services should come about to provide for older people living in urban settings. Another question often raised is that there is this there is a risk of intergenerational conflict. I think Laura also referred to that if there is greater fraction of population categorized as older people, and as we know, older people are more likely to vote than younger people, then is there a risk that such greater voting power would lead to an intergenerational conflict towards use of or allocation of resources, public resources. So what a general conclusion from all this discussion and all this work that we have done is that specific policies are required. Just economic development is not sufficient, but in fact specific policies are required which will put a greater focus on reaping the fullest benefits of the potential of older people by helping them to stay healthy and active in their later life. Now, I will use just another 5-6 minutes to introduce this work that we have been doing since 2012. Now we have done 3 reports on Global Age Watch Index. So I thought this was a very good opportunity to introduce some of our audience to the index and see what benefits it offers in our thinking about aging and its consequences or its challenges to international development. What is Global Age Watch Index? It is a first of its kind, which is a global measure of a framework that brings together multidimensional indicators of older people's well-being. So emphasis is on well-being, and the emphasis is that is not unidimensional analysis like very often we end up doing, looking at people's income or health. In fact, it goes beyond that. The focus is on comparative evidence, and often you learn more about your own country when you start comparing your country to other countries. So that's the focus here. And sometimes such insights are not possible by undertaking country-specific in-depth analysis. But above all, by doing this kind of comparative multidimensional analysis, we identify policies and institutions that have been very effective in improving well-being of older people. It's a part of process in which Helpage International, with my contribution towards this index, is raising awareness about the circumstances of older people across the world. And also, and I will show that in the findings in a minute, that it identifies knowledge gaps, what knowledge gaps we have about older people's well-being. And in the process, it helps promoting collection of additional, better quality, age disaggregated data. And this is a debate going on now in the UN and in many of the countries, that in the pursuit of sustainable development goals, what additional data they need to collect to get a sense of baseline position of older people's well-being, and then monitoring of changes in that over time. Now, quickly, this picture will tell you everything that you need to know about the Global Age Watch Index. It uses 13 indicators of 4 domains: income security, health status, capability, and enabling environment. For instance, we look at different indicators with respect to income, we look at the life expectancy, we look at mental well-being, we look at whether older people live in enabling environment where they have social connections, where they have physical safety, civic freedom, as well as access to public services such as public transport. And basic idea is that by looking at this multidimensional analysis, we can identify specific policy priorities for each country. And in the process, we'll identify also what countries may have done well with respect to different aspects of well-being of older people, and what policies may have been responsible for that. It uses the comparative data available from WHO, from World Bank, from ILO, UNESCO, and Gallup. The choice of indicators also reflected what data was available. Ideally, we would have included more indicators had there been data available. Most of the indicators are outcome indicators, though, so they do not mention the process underlying well-being of older people, but actually looking at the outcome of older people. So we do not look at access to health care provisions, but in fact just look at healthy life expectancy. So what are the findings from this? And I will spend only a couple of minutes on this. These 94 countries, we can get a sense of which countries do very well and which countries do not do very well. It's not surprising that the well-resourced and richer countries of Europe do very well. Also, Canada, Japan, and USA part of that group. And countries right at the bottom are not are countries that are doing mostly African countries, but also we have Afghanistan and Pakistan amongst them, and those are not very good places to grow old in. You see, China is right in the middle, and India. These are the two fastest growing economies, China and India. They are doing very well when it comes to economic development, but when it comes to the well-being of older people, they are nowhere near the top. China just about makes it in the middle of the distribution, and India is actually more towards the bottom than the middle. So that basically tells us that countries in the process of going through international development, economic development, will need to allocate specific resources towards older people's well-being. Portugal is more in the bottom part, but not quite, not more in the top part, but not quite in the top rank. This is very important because this tells us that this Global Age Watch Index exercise already points to a lot of data gaps, that we find that we could only cover 11 out of 54 African countries in this process, mainly because in majority of the countries we had missing basic information on income poverty amongst the others. So if we really are concerned about population aging and its consequences, the first thing we need to do is to strengthen the statistical community in these countries, where we would have the information about older people, their income, and what potential that goes untapped um, uh, for the process of economic development. When we look at the results across domains, we find that the top ranking countries are mostly doing very well in all domains. If we look at Portugal, it does very well in income security, but it does not do very well with respect to employment and education of older people, and also not so well in enabling environment. Lower ranked countries are mostly ranked lower in all all different aspects, but in some cases we could see that a lot more needed doing in improving the enabling environment for older people. I don't have time to go into specific results for Portugal, but basically it shows that there's lots of all these 13 different indicators give us a sense of where that country is, and if we were to compare where, if we were to identify policy priorities where new policies and programs need to be introduced, then such nation-specific results provide very useful information. And you could look at the Global Age Watch Index web page for more information. Now, very quickly, some generic findings from Global Age Watch Index. The first one is history counts. So countries that started early in introducing progressive social welfare policies, not just taking care of issues that arise in old age, but actually providing good healthcare provision, providing good opportunities for employment throughout the life course. Those countries stand out. And here, a typical example given is the Nordic countries. These countries, which as old as many years ago as close to 100 years ago, introduced basic income security, basic health care provision for citizens of all ages, and now we are seeing positive impact of those policies. Money is not everything. In fact, what is required is more smart age-focused spending, that countries will have to give priority to enhancing the potential of older people, empowering older people, and just having high economic growth does not trickle down to such policy focus. We have examples, good policy examples from Latin America and also from Eastern Asian countries, where we see that ensuring access to quality health care throughout the life course has been vital in achieving good health outcomes in later life. And if we want to have aging becomes, older people become a resource in the economic development process, then it requires action from all. This cannot be just the governments coming up with policies towards healthcare provision and opportunities for employment and savings, but it's required. It requires actions from individuals as well, that we need to have lifestyle changes that will help us to stay in better health and be more active in old age. And it's never too late to start investing in aging. We have learned that other countries which started late, Mauritius is one example, Southern Latin American countries are other example, that they, having learned from the good experiences of Nordic countries, have started close to 20, 30 years ago, started investing in provision of resources towards older people, and we see the positive impacts on the well-being of older people now, and thus it's never too late to start investing in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Asghar. I encourage everybody in the audience to, if you have questions, type them up on the chat window that appears on the side of your screen there. Maybe I could just take this moment to invite Asghar to respond to Sarah's question about political participation and governance. Is not included in your index?
Not really, no. We have to be careful that such index cannot possibly take into account all aspects of well-being. So especially when you have the aspiration to do it globally. And so we miss out information for a large majority of population, large majority of countries to include such information. But it's the first shot at constructing such index. So we're going through its revision. The next version of the index will come out in 2018, and we will be taking into account additional aspects of well-being.
While we wait for other people to put in questions, maybe I could ask Laura something that sort of struck me in your presentation about this problem of unintended social consequences. I mean, is it, in your view, is it that projects are just not designed well enough? Are these unintended social consequences? Are they foreseeable but not adequately planned for, or are they really things that surprise us when it comes out at the end? I mean, and we just not understand well enough to be able to anticipate some of these things in advance.
I think that's a very good point. There's a nice paper by White and Massett from 2007 where they do a re-evaluation of the Bangladesh Integrated Nutrition Project, and essentially what they find is that the expected sort of chain of actions breaks down because the assumption was that daughter-in-laws in Bangladesh would be firstly have enough spare time to go to nutritional counselling, and secondly that having done that they could bring back the knowledge and influence decisions made about household food provision. And they found this wasn't happening, that in fact the counselling should perhaps have targeted fathers and mother-in-laws to have had better effect. If you know even a little bit about Bangladesh, this does not seem in any way surprising, and possibly an outcome that could have been foreseen and maybe was foreseen, but possibly not by people who had enough influence to change the programme design. But I mean, that's one example. I think there are genuinely unanticipated social consequences, and Adate's 2007 paper looks, I mean, not so much, I suppose, at disastrous consequences, but at ways in which people slightly subvert programs that you wouldn't necessarily have expected. So people meeting the weight conditionalities by getting their children to drink very large amounts of water immediately before they're weighed, or parents thinking, well, if these iron tablets are a good thing for one child, then they must be a good thing for all my children, so I'll just break them into little bits and hand them out, and then surprise surprise, it doesn't really remove anemia in any child. So I mean, I think Howard White has argued quite powerfully for a much longer design process where you're sort of really thinking through these potential problems, but I'm sure there will always be things that you will miss.
Is it a case where there needs to be a stronger sort of social development voice in project planning and taking into account? I mean, there's different kinds of evidence and that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, I'm inclined to think that programs should be preceded by quite systematic reviews of the evidence for the kind of mechanisms by which they operate. And I think that is part of a DFID business case, but if any advisors are listening in, they can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I mean, it just seems, there's often a great deal of political enthusiasm to sort of roll out something that seems like a beneficial solution in one country and transfer it to your country and then roll it out at scale. But I think piloting and an attitude of caution is probably more appropriate.
Mm. Asghar, you mentioned intergenerational conflict, and Laura sort of started from the point of view of intergenerational relations and support and obligations, and I think that seems like a very interesting question to me. The political disparity between the generations. Asghar, you referred to the political power of older people, which maybe could I ask maybe both of you to say a little bit about how you see that relationship? Do you see it as problematic, or do you see a very good chance that we'll be able to satisfy the desires of people at both ends of the age spectrum?
I think Asghar argued quite powerfully for healthy ageing starting essentially in childhood. So it's not necessarily a transfer of resources, it's sort of thinking throughout the life course. But I could, even looking at the index, I could see potential areas of conflict. And also, I suppose, the difficulties of finding a truly comparative index. Because, for example, employment participation among 55 to 64-year-olds, in the UK where you're expected to work to 68, these don't really seem like old people participating in the labour force. That's what we'll all be doing. But obviously, where people are no longer able to afford to retire early, then the labour market becomes sort of still more constrained. And then with other factors, obviously, around the rollback of social provisioning and the reduction of the state in many countries, it's sort of not compensated by a strong development of the private sector. I mean, there is then, which Kate would have talked about, quite a lot of queuing for what are seen to be good jobs.
Mm.
So it does. I suppose I'm saying that sometimes when you look on an individual level, you can see many examples of where the generations are sort of mutually supportive. But you can also see how resource conflict might quite easily develop. And this has certainly been found in for young men in many African countries, that they're not able to progress to adulthood because, for example, sort of all the women that they would have married are married to much older men.
No, I just like to add to that. I think there is a risk that this will lead to conflict across generations, across different age groups. As yet, this has not happened, partly because older people do not just care for their own well-being. They are also grandparents, and they have their own children who are in the younger age group. So when they vote for a policy, they have in mind not just their own well-being, but the altruistic feelings towards the other generations as well. But it remains a risk if government policies continue to push for provision towards older generation because they vote more often and they are becoming larger in proportions, then such generational conflict will materialize. When it comes to an example and linking to Laura's response on this question, is that one of the message I was trying to take out from all this work that we have done is that we have to empower older people. We have to give them more opportunities to stay active and healthy. And when in a country there is high youth unemployment, then such message comes as if we care more for one age group than the other, and resources are going in one direction, and thus other age groups are left out from this such policy development. The argument then is that actually societies that are embarking on a sustainable development process, they provide opportunities irrespective of any age discrimination. So they do not favor one age group over the other. They provide equal opportunities for youth and the old to stay active. And we have learned from our comparative analysis that societies which provide better employment opportunities to older workers are also those societies that are very good in providing employment opportunities to younger generations.
We have a couple of questions from audience members. Ken Bluestone asks, one challenge with any discussion of demographic shifts is focusing, it creates artificial divisions, sort of this conflict that we were just mentioning. How can research really take that whole life course perspective into account? Is research inherently going to be focused on particular age groups, or how do you take the broad view, I guess, is the question in research?
Well, thank you, Ken, for asking this question, which is quite relevant. And this aspect I missed in responding to this risk of intergenerational conflict. Today's young population is indeed tomorrow's older population. So we could, in that respect, see less of conflict if we could say any investment towards provisions in old age are likely to benefit not just today's older population, but also a future older population, which is now a younger population. When we think, and if we start thinking in those terms and start investing early in life towards education, towards employment, towards provision of better opportunities, then those early interventions reap benefits later in life. So one could also say that by empowering future generations of older people starts by empowering younger generation of today, by giving them better opportunities for health and employment and savings. Life course specific research is extremely difficult, even in well-resourced statistical communities like the UK. We do not have often enough longitudinal data, enough data that could provide us information over the whole life course to provide information on how early interventions result in what outcomes, what early interventions can result in what outcomes in later life. And that becomes even more difficult in less developed countries where we are struggling with better data but a better investment towards that would lead us to having better evidence and thus identifying interventions that would improve lives of older people in the future.
I mean, I would just add to that. As a researcher, I suppose I also tend to see it as a data problem. But we have to acknowledge, as Asghar was doing, that longitudinal research is extremely expensive, and that's possibly why it's been concentrated in the global north, where we do have amazing cohort studies that have run for 60 or so years. We don't yet have that kind of data in the global south, although there are some studies that have been running for sort of 30 or 40 years or so. I think what we've tried to do, so, for example, within the GSDRC study that I described, we'll be tracking the child over a period of between 8 and 14 years, but it won't just be the child that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at their peers, their siblings, their parents, other trusted adults such as aunts. So there'll be a mosaic of information gathered around the child, looking at all their important relationships. And then there'll also be specific techniques such as intergenerational trios, where you talk to girls, their parents, and their mothers and grandmothers to try and look at the way that life has changed, and that expectations have changed as well. It is very tricky to do good life course research, although I think there are now a greater range of approaches that you can draw on, and it's something also that anthropologists are moving more into as they sort of build up relationships with communities over a fairly elongated period of time. I mean, this connects also to what Sarah was saying about the Western nature of the concept generationing development. It was developed by a group of researchers at ISS, of whom Roy Tuishman is one. But what's quite nice about it was a group of researchers working across the ages. So some were working with children, some were working with older people, some were working with young women or young families. And it was a way of trying to bring together the insights across the life course rather than can work in silos, as we were discussing. Although one of the problems is that research funding often comes in silos, so people will happily fund you to study children and young people or older people, and there are specific funders that you go to if you want that sort of money, but it's very hard to get any funder to sponsor you across the life course. There's one example by the ESRC, which is slightly confusingly called, I think, the Young Lives is just one component of it, but essentially they funded 9 linked studies which traversed the life course, and I'd really recommend having a look at those, particularly because they've archived much of their data, so it's sort of open for reanalysis.
Okay. And do you want to say anything more about the generationing development in response to Sarah's point? Or?
Let me just scan back to it. So when they disappear. I think the idea that relationships are important, and that it's important to look at relationships across as well as within generations, although of course the idea of linked lives within cohorts is important too, is quite a simple concept, which I think is fairly well evidenced by research in other countries. I mean, I think the problem with obviously labels and theoretical concepts is that they do become, in trying to make themselves sound not like common sense, they can adopt a sort of linguistic register, which then makes them quite difficult to use. So what I was trying to emphasize was that the insight I took from it was that it's really important to look at people's relationships, to not consider them as isolated individuals, but to see the social context in which they're embedded.
Thanks. And maybe we have one more question from the floor from Francis Winter asking about can you suggest good data on the impact of caring for older people on younger generations? And of course this goes both ways. Are there people who are studying that sort of question?
Sorry, let me have a quick careful look. There's a good data on the younger people, care for older people on younger generations.
Yeah,
no,
I guess younger people caring for older people, what is the impact on them?
Well, we know from some of the work that we are doing in the UK context that provision of care by family members not only enhances the well-being of the person who is cared for, but also the carer feel more valued and see a purpose in their life, and in that process it also enhances their well-being. But it's a generic conclusion we draw because caring could be of varying nature. Some could be very intensive, so anything beyond 20 hours per week can be very demanding and can have very negative consequences on carers. Also, what sort of challenges, what sort of person they are caring, what sort of a disability that they are caring for. We know dementia care, for instance, is extremely demanding, even if it's for minimal number of hours. So I do not know to what extent there is information on older people providing care for younger generation, but there is some evidence, lots of evidence we have on what is the impact on older people for providing care to either their family members or to others, and it's very mixed. It can benefit them depending upon the intensity of the care, or it can actually be a problem, serious problem for their own health.
Laura, do you have any thoughts on
Just
caring?
to say, I know of a number of qualitative studies, not really systematically gather quantitative data. And with the qualitative studies, there are often confounding factors. So quite a lot of work has been done in Uganda around the impact on older people of caring for essentially their grandchildren after they've become orphaned by HIV/AIDS. But obviously there are a number of different factors coming into play there. So it's hard to isolate the impact of the actual caring act itself. And then in Thailand, for example, particularly northern Thailand, there are many villages where, due to migration, there are essentially sort of the middle generation has disappeared, and then I was involved in a study on this about 5 years ago, and then older people reported how well, some of them felt very positively about the chance to sort of to support their families in this way by caring for their grandchildren, but others did feel somewhat that they've been deprived of their old age because they weren't able to occupy the role that they perhaps expected to occupy at this stage of life, and were in a sense sort of reliving the intensities of parenthood. So the qualitative evidence doesn't really provide a consistent picture, I'm afraid.
Mm. Okay, well, I think we've. Thank you, everybody, for who was also not only asking questions but also sharing advice and links and suggestions in the chat box. That's really helpful. I think we've caught all the questions, so I think unless I've missed anything, we can probably wrap up the conversation. I'd like to thank both Laura and Asghar for your presentations. It's interesting that, I mean, both of you sort of highlight some issues that we know about in a way in across development. The importance of looking at particular policies and evaluation methods to respond specifically to the needs of different age groups. One solution does not fit all, and the need for evaluation and to take in a variety of perspectives and social factors to play a large role. And also, we both talked about well-being being very important in a broad sense, so a broad understanding of well-being and what we mean by the good life that we're trying to achieve for everybody, being very important at all stages. And I guess there's a few interesting avenues for research that have been suggested as well, issues to look into, including the opportunity for maybe there will be increasing opportunities for this kind of life course research coming in more and more developing countries. So thank you very much to both of you, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. And I wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you, Brian.
Bye.
Thank you, Laura. Bye.